Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me. So that this is not a solo show, even if it's a small audience, it's better than talking to myself. Today, I want to cover asset impairments, which is a critical topic in the accounting environment today, especially with the pandemic, with the ongoing inflation and general condition of the economy. Impairments are widespread and are such an important aspect of accounting and recognizing losses in a timely basis, recognizing the erosion of value in our assets. So I want to talk about the process, of course, talk about the concept behind it. Then I'm going to wrap up the lecture with just, kind of some brief thoughts about preparing for exam 5 as well as the final. I already expressed most of it on the announcement, but just to reiterate some things, I felt it would be good to give some air to that as well. And you'll let you ask any questions you might have. So what is asset impairment? If you recall, way back in the income statement chapter, we talked about the impairment of discontinued operations. And that was a general way of approaching impairment, a topic that you hadn't really been exposed to at any point. But in a very general way, we talked about impairing a discontinued operation. Really, what's occurring when you're impairing that discontinued operation is that you're assessing the impairment of assets that are within that discontinued division. And so you're not, it sounded like we were judging the whole company, and in a way we are, because we're looking at all of the assets within that discontinued operation to see if any of those assets need impairment. But for example, it could have just been one equipment account that needed to be impaired, or some other account that needed impairment within the discontinued division. It could have been more than one as well, but that was the idea behind it. So we were just conducting asset impairments to assets within the discontinued division of the company. So what is impairment in general? If we think about depreciation, right? Depreciation shows a gradual decline in the revenue generating ability of assets. And it's not that they're wearing and tearing, but basically because if the useful life of an asset is the total number of years that will I'll say that the asset will generate revenue, then over time, right, as we get, say, a 10-year useful life, as we get to year 5, half of the revenue generating ability of that asset has been used up, consumed in the operations. Year 7, now we're at 70% of the revenue generating ability. There's only 30% left. And so in that way, it's a decline in the total amount of revenue that I believe an asset will contribute to my company. And it's gradual. We track it with depreciation and reduce the book value of that asset accordingly. Now, impairments, on the other hand, are a much more radical, significant reduction of the book value of an asset when we believe the revenue generating ability of the asset has come into question. And this is an unexpected reduction. We expect that over time, any asset we're using by merit of it having a finite useful life, it's not going to always produce these revenues. But this is an unexpected reduction. This is a significant change to what we thought. And therefore, we apply a more radical procedure that needs more significant disclosure and also impacts net income more significantly in the year that we decide to apply the impairment. It's different. It's applied differently to assets that we intend to hold for sale versus those we intend to hold for use. So we're going to see that any assets we hold for sale, we apply just a little bit different methodology, similar to the discontinued operations, versus those that we're going to continue to use in our company, because it might be that this impairment represents something that is, we just want to wash our hands of this asset. We need to get rid of it because it has had such an unexpected decline in its revenue generating ability. Or it could just be, we're going to weather the storm. We're going to continue to use the asset, even though there has been this significant change in its revenue generating ability. We also apply the process differently for assets with finite lives and intangibles that have infinite lives. So finite life assets are all PP&E assets. Except land. And of course, finite life intangibles. Remember that intangibles are either finite life or indefinite life. I tend to use infinite and indefinite. Interchangeably, so don't be tripped up by that. Definite versus finite, indefinite versus infinite. Those things are the same idea. So remember that finite life intangibles, those are like copyrights, goodwill. Sorry, not goodwill. Copyrights, patents. Those are the most common ones. Sometimes we will have in development R&D. As an asset that is intangible with a finite life. It's easier to say which ones are indefinite or infinite lives. Those are goodwill and trademarks. Those have infinite lives, or assumed to have infinite life. Franchises as well, because franchises are just the right to use a company's trademark. So, you know, whatever company that you're thinking of, there's so many franchises like Gold's Gym franchises, even though they don't call them Gold's Gym anymore, they call them Fitness Project. But that Gold's Gym owns the trademark. The main company owns that trademark. They can sell it, the right to use that trademark, to local people like the guy in Houston who owns all of those, all of the ones in this area. And that's a franchise. So that's just the right to use the trademark. So it makes sense that franchises also have indefinite lives. Remember that one of the hallmark differences between finite life intangibles and indefinite life intangibles is that we allocate finite life intangibles through amortization, right? We apply that cost allocation process to them on a consistent basis, showing their gradual decline in revenue generating ability, versus with the indefinite life intangibles, we do not apply amortization to these assets. We leave them at their book value, which forces us to check for impairment to be sure that their revenue generating ability has not been changed in some significant way. All right. So for PP&E and finite life intangibles, how do we test for impairment? First, we got to know the circumstances. maybe there's been a significant decline in the market value. So that would be perhaps changes in supply and demand, force this item to no longer be appreciated in the consumer market. Therefore, our revenues that we thought we could generate are no longer going to be there. We have to look for impairment. An adverse change in how the asset is being used or its physical condition. This can be related to a couple of things. It could be related to some sort of adverse change in legal factors or business practices. For example, there's an example that the book just talks about briefly about maybe the Environmental Protection Agency recently found that the company was polluting a stream close by with its manufacturing process. And so the company had to retool and revisit how it was using its machinery to avoid that. And that would be an adverse change in how the asset is being used. It could be the legal factor just made them not be able to use it at all. It could be some sort of a rapid deterioration based on climate changes in the area. Some sort of mass weather event could have caused a change in the physical condition such that it hampered its ability. A history of losses or projection of losses that would be associated with the asset. And that's very vague. It could again be it could be correlated with any one of these three factors. So the key is there has to be a triggering event for these two, PP&E and finite life intangibles. Impairment is not something we just check for on a regular basis for these classes of assets. There has to be some sort of a change in circumstances or a triggering event that causes us to look into this process. Once we have a triggering event identified, then we determine that we go in, we get curious, we say, should we test for impairment? Is that a necessary thing? And the very first step is using what we call the test for recoverability. The question is this asset recoverable? Recoverable in terms of dollar value. So when I test for recoverability, I look at what the estimated future cash flows, and I say project, I'm not sure why, of the asset are, and compare that to its book value. So we only want to impair when the undiscounted cash flows are less than the book value of the asset at this date. When I'm talking about estimated future cash flows, all I'm doing is looking at, all right, I think it's going to produce X number of units this year. That means $1 million, or I'm going to collect $1 million in cash from this guy this year. Then I think it's going to probably produce Y in the second year. So maybe that's 900,000. So I got $1 million in the first year, 900 in the second year. And maybe it just continues like that for 5 years, decreasing by 100,000. So if I get $1 million of cash flow in year 1, year 2, I get 900K, year 3, I get 800K. And then let's say that that's the last year I was going to, or we'll do one more year, year 4, it drops maybe down to 400K. And this was the final useful year. And then I was going to sell it at that point. And at the final use for year, I was also going to get salvage of, we'll say, 100,000. That is, quite frankly, just how I would, a very basic idea of how I would assess what the estimated future cash flows are. I would take $1 million plus 900 plus 800 plus 400 plus 100. Those are all the flows that this item is going to get undiscounted. And that's a big qualification, because we're going to look in a bit how that can change when we determine how much we should impair it for. But again, we're just asking ourselves a yes or no question. Should it be impaired? Yes or no. We're not worried about magnitude at this point. In order to say yes or no, we do look at the magnitude of undiscounted cash flows and compare it to the book value of the asset, right? And think about it. If this is, I'll do the math real quick, 1.2, 2.2, 3.1, 3.2, $3.2 million of undiscounted future cash flows. If the book value of the asset is greater than that, so let's say that the book value of the asset is 3.5 million, then the economic benefits I'm claiming on my balance sheet do not match the reality of what I'm actually going to get from this asset, right? Since the balance sheet is overstating my future cash flows, then I have a problem. That's when I need to assess impairment. The asset is not recoverable. The amount of cash flow I'm going to get does not match the benefits that I'm stating I have with this asset. If it was the other case, if it was, say, a $2.5 million book value, then we'd be okay, because my book value is an understatement of the total amount that I expect I'm going to get. The asset is then for recoverable. All right, so that's the yes or no. Now I look into the magnitude. How much is the impairment loss? This is when we want to look at the difference between the asset's book value and the asset's fair value. Basically, what we want to happen is for the impaired value, the new value after impairment, to be equal to the fair value. We reset accumulated depreciation. Don't worry about that right now. We'll look at it in a journal entry. And we just basically treat the asset as if it were acquired at fair market value at that point in time. So all we're doing is reducing the book value to the fair value. When we're looking for fair value, remember, this is just the sell price. It could be difficult to come up with the fair value for particular assets, especially intangible assets, right? I mean, if you're thinking about a patent, which is unique in itself, because if it's a patent, that means no one else can copy it, right? So you're not going to be able to go and look up a Kelley Blue Book value, you know, as if you were selling an automobile for a patent. You're not going to have a market to establish the price of this patent. And quite honestly, that's going to be true for a lot of the equipment and machinery that is used by companies, manufacturing companies, to produce units, or just any company that is in business, because typically they modify their assets to a point where it's hard to find a market value. So we want to use a market price if we can get it, but if we can't have a market price, then we'll use the discounted future cash flows of the asset to determine what fair market value will be. So notice the difference here, the discounted future cash flows versus the undiscounted future cash flows. We're going to use that to determine this estimate, which when I say this estimate, I'm referring to fair value. What is the difference between undiscounted cash flows and discounted cash flows? It is simply, we are discounting future cash flows to a single, I wrote that a little too close, present value. Okay. So when we discount all of these future cash flows, all we're doing is taking the present value of $1 million 1 year from now, 900 2 years from now, 800 3 years from now, 400 4 years from now, and then that additional 100 4 years from now, and summing them up into a single present value. They will not equal 3.2 million any longer, because 3.2 million is the value of those flows in the future, and present value is always going to be on an equivalent basis. It's stronger, so this will actually be much less in a present value than it will be in the future. $1 today is always worth more than $1 in the future, and that's why this will be less as a present value. So that's how I want to determine the fair value. If we're just reducing the book value to the fair value, once we have an estimate of the fair value, then the impairment loss is just going to be equal, as I say up here, the difference between the book value of the asset less its fair value. But again, the fair value is what becomes a little trickier, what becomes an estimate, what becomes something that has a lot of uncertainty, and something that can and should be audited carefully when you are dealing with impairments. Can these be recovered? So if I write the value of an asset down, can I in the future reverse course and add that value back? No, we don't do that. Under GAAP, IFRS allows what we call asset reversals, where they can write them back up to their original value if the conditions change. But under US GAAP, we only write down, we do not write up. A disclosure note is going to be needed to describe the impairment process. It would, involve perhaps some of the methodology to determine fair value. How the company went about doing that, the circumstances that caused the impairment. And of course, the amount of the impairment would all be in the footnotes. This is a disclosure note, but when I say disclosure note, what I really mean is a footnote. There's no like little footnote at the bottom of the financial statement. There's just the expansive like 60 pages of footnotes that follow them. All right, so that again, PP&E and finite life intangible impairment process. Test for recoverability first. Well, first, we gotta have some sort of adverse triggering event. We test for recoverability. We find the fair value. We can use a market price if it's available, but barring that, one very common way is to use the discounted future cash flows to proxy for the fair value of this item. We take the difference to find out the amount we impair, and then we have to disclose in the footnotes to PP&E, to intangible assets, why we impaired, how we impaired, and the methodology behind it. So let's look at an example. We got Rocky Innovations. They carry machinery at $400,000 book value. That's an original cost of $1 million less $600,000 accumulated depreciation due to some environmental legislation enacted against the byproducts of machinery's use. They believe that there could be some impairment going on. The undiscounted cash flows are $350, and I give you that the discounted future cash flows are $310. How should Rocky, account for the transaction? And so, should we impair and why? Well, there's a couple of. First, of course, we have a change in circumstances And that causes me to say, well, let's test for impairment, right? There was a legal issue that caused me to enact any sort of impairment tests. And then the first step I take is the recoverability test to see if the asset's book value is recoverable. And in order to do that, remember, I'm looking at the book value of the asset and comparing it against its undiscounted future cash flow. And I got the book value up here is 400,000. And then I look at where its undiscounted cash flows are, 350,000. The book value is greater than the undiscounted cash flow. And because it's an overstatement, again, we think about, well, this suggests I have $400,000 of economic benefits in this asset. The economic benefits I'm going to get from this asset, including all the revenues it's going to produce and its potential sell price, salvage at the end of its life, are not even coming to that. So it's not recoverable. So this indicates that I need to impair. And it's important that you show this test and show why you're doing it and show that you're using the appropriate numbers. Because, for example, you could judge it's, yes, you should impair because you're comparing 400,000 and 310,000. But that's not the appropriate test, right? It's not the appropriate test to use the discounted future cash flows and the recoverability, because that would actually cause us to be a little too conservative in our determination of fair value, because the discounted cash flows are always going to be less than the undiscounted cash flows because of time value of money. Because they're always going to be less, it's always more likely I'm going to impair if I were to use this in my recoverability test. So I want to make sure I'm using the right cash flows. We want to use the undiscounted ones when we're doing step one. Step two, the amount to be impaired and what is the journal entry. So for step two, we got the amount to be impaired, remember, is the book value minus of the asset minus the fair value of the asset. That gives me my impairment loss. And in this case, I'm not given a fair value, but I am given the discounted future cash flows at 310,000. So I'm just going to use that as my fair value. And I still have a book value of 400,000. So if I want to bring the book value of this item down to 310,000, I should impair it by 90,000. So use discounted cash flows as fair value here. In order to record it, there's one thing I have to remember it in recording it, is that I actually want to reset accumulated depreciation to 0. And I still haven't really completely understood why we do this. It would be the same if I didn't do this. The book value would still be the same. But anyway, so we got accumulated depreciation, 600,000. We need to reset that to 0. I got that accumulated depreciation up here in the problem. I know the impairment loss is 90,000, so I'm just going to abbreviate it, but record it. Impairment loss of 90,000. And together, those tell me how much I want to reduce the asset by. So here I would, it's machinery, so I'll just call it equipment. 690,000. So those two added together tell me how much I should charge the equipment. If you notice, then what happens is it looks a little weird, like I'm impairing by 90,000, but I'm charging 690 to the equipment. Remember, the equipment is recorded at historical cost. So it's at $1 million right now. And its accumulated depreciation was at 600,000. That's what was giving me the $400,000 book value, this amount less its contra account, reported on the balance sheet at 400,000. Well, after I apply this impairment entry, the accumulated depreciation goes to 0, and I credit my equipment by 690,000, which brings it down to 310,000. And so we were successful in our goal, which was to reduce the book value down to fair value, because now, I'm sorry, yeah, down to the amount of the fair value, because now the new book value is 310 minus 0, which is a book value of 310,000. Now, after this happens, understand that you have to update depreciation for the equipment. So it still has a useful life remaining. If it's going to continue to be used in the company's operations, then I just have to determine, all right, how much should I adjust my depreciation every year for, given that I've now recognized a substantial amount of loss in, or 90,000 of the 400, yeah, it's pretty substantial. Almost a quarter of a loss in its value. How is that going to affect my depreciation going forward? You would just take 310, if it's straight line, 310,000 minus any salvage, divided by the useful years left. And that would give you a new depreciation estimate. Typically, what will happen is, because you're recognizing loss in value, is that the depreciation estimate will drop for future years, right? Because there's less to depreciate. So essentially, you're almost accelerating some of the amount of depreciation by recognizing this impairment. And because you're recognizing it in this year, there's less to recognize in the subsequent years. All right, any questions?